This presentation is brought to you by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and I just want to take a minute to say that our mission in the department is the conservation of the fish, wildlife, plants, and all of their habitats for the people of Vermont. And what that means is that this mission really takes us into a lot of different types of work beyond just fish and wildlife, and it takes us into the conservation of habitats and ecosystems and all of the ecological processes that happen in those places. And that brings us to the doorsteps of many Vermonters. We serve all Vermonters, from hunters and anglers to people who just like to watch wildlife from a distance. And as Andy was mentioning, we work closely with towns and communities. I work closely with landowners, providing direct assistance with them to improve habitat on their property. And we take this commitment seriously for future generations, so everyone can enjoy what we have here in Vermont into the future. Just to put a couple faces with names, you met Andy at the beginning of the presentation. He and his colleague Jens and I have been doing a three-part webinar series. This is the third webinar in that series. But Andy and Jens work with communities and in town planning, and I work with private landowners. So today we're going to talk about backyard wildlife conservation and why backyards matter. I'm going to try to give you some habitat tips for your backyard and also on bigger woodlots. I'm sure there's some people who have some larger properties on the presentation today, and then we'll just kind of go through some concluders and some questions. So we'll start off with backyard conservation. So here's a picture of my backyard and then the backyard of my parents who live just around the corner from me in Essex. And I think it's pretty safe to say that this year we've all spent a lot of time in our backyards. And, from the emails and the questions that I've gotten this year, spending all this time at home has made a lot of us notice things a little differently just in our backyards and really think about how we can fit into nature a little bit more and influence conservation in Vermont, even when we're sticking close to our neighborhoods, which is really great. I want to start by reading a quote by an author who's an entomologist, Doug Tallamy. And he's been kind of banging this backyard wildlife conservation drum for a while. And he writes that we must abandon the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. Though vital as short-term refuges, nature preserves are not large enough to meet our ecological needs, so we must restore the natural world where we live, work, and play. And because nearly 85% of the U.S. is privately owned, our private properties are an opportunity for long-term conservation if we design them to meet the needs of life around us. And so these are two books that he has written that are quite interesting and quite pertinent if you're interested in backyard wildlife. So I recommend looking those up. And I think, Tallamy's point can be seen very clearly when we kind of take a larger landscape view. We zoom out and look at the landscape on BioFinder. Our natural world is evolving and becoming more fragmented, and the lines between forests and our neighborhoods are kind of becoming really blurry. This is a screenshot of Essex and Essex Junction where I live, and you can see that the backyards can be in a very suburban setting in neighborhoods, or they can lead into large continuous forest blocks like the Mount Mansfield and the Camel's Hump blocks that you can see here. So this just has the BioFinder forest block layer highlighted on it. The map showing all the connected green space, even in a heavily suburban area, heavily suburban for Vermont, it's clear that our backyards are really stepping stones between larger blocks of habitat. And because over 85% of Vermont is privately owned, our backyards are a real great opportunity for long-term conservation if we design them in the right way. So, that's kind of a long way to say that backyards are important. Well, can everyone just make sure they're muted, just so everyone can hear? So backyards are important, and there's really a collective power in backyard habitat. And before we get too far into this habitat conversation, just kind of want to talk about the basics of habitat components. Wildlife habitat really consists of 4 different components: food, water, shelter, space, and then the 5th component would be the arrangement of all of those others in relation to one another. And it doesn't matter if the area or the wildlife is big and small. In order to create these habitat components, we're going to focus on connectivity, native plants, invertebrates, food, structures, and how to keep it messy. And so, whether you're talking about a bald eagle or a goldfinch, these birds need the same components. And so we'll just take our first quick break now that everyone's kind of settled in and signed in, and I just want to make sure everyone's still with me. And if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them right now.
No questions in the chat so far, Andrea.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there will be later. So we'll continue on. So rather than just having me kind of on your screen blabbing about different habitat tips and techniques, I wanted to kind of tell a little bit of a story about a landowner that I worked with this summer, and talk about how he is managing his property, and talk about how that can be done on backyard scale. So this is Tim. He lives in Shrewsbury. This is an aerial shot that he took with his drone of his property. He owns about 400 acres, which is admittedly a much larger backyard than probably most of us have. But it's a really cool property. It's been in his family for several generations, and it backs up into a few state forests and into the Killington mountain ski area. So we got the Coolidge State Forest over on the right side, and the Aitken State Forest over on the left. And so it's just this really large property. And he's just a really cool landowner. He is interested in keeping it all public, wants to do a lot of different work and make sure he's doing the right thing for wildlife. And so, when I first went to talk to him, we talked about his objectives. So this is another shot that he took with his drone, just in a different season, probably kind of what it looks like now. And number one, of course, his main objective is to enjoy his property. I think we can all identify with that. But then he was really interested in climate change resiliency, which we can kind of break down into making sure there's connectivity on his property and diversity in the habitats and in the plant species that are there. And then he also wants to make it more inviting for wildlife. And to me, what that really means is creating food sources, and also structures. And so food sources being things that are going to attract birds and mammals, but also the base of the food web, so our native pollinators and all those invertebrates. And so just to kind of take a perspective of a smaller landowner, Tim had a big forest management plan, and so that kind of forced him to think about what he wanted to do. But if you have a smaller property and you don't have a forest management plan, it can be a little overwhelming sometimes thinking about where you want to start. And I just really encourage people to take the time and think about, what is it that you enjoy? What are the things that you want to see even just in your backyard? Go get on BioFinder and take a look at what your neighborhood looks like, and see what kind of properties are surrounding you, and what they have on their properties. And there's a lot of resources. I've listed a couple here that are electronic apps or websites, so you can start identifying what's around you. Go Botany is a great website if you're interested in plants. It helps you kind of identify mysterious plants that you see. And then, of course, eBird and iNaturalist are great resources for birds and pollinators and all of the other little things that you see. So back to Tim. So to kind of address one of his first things with climate change, we talked about creating connectivity on his property. And we really focused on this riparian area that he has, cutting down the main part of his land. And as you can see in this picture here, he's got this stream bed, and then he's got a real small buffer, and then a pretty wide mowed trail. And he had been noticing over the last couple of years that the stream bank had been eroding. The water temperature really wasn't the same, and you just kind of saw like the quality of the riparian area go down. And so we were talking about increasing that riparian buffer. So really increasing the width of the space between the shores of the water and where he mows. And so he's decided with our guidance that he's going to move that trail. It's just a mowed trail, so he's going to move that back another 20 feet and let that riparian area kind of grow up. He's going to do a little bit of planting, native trees and shrubs. We're going to focus on different willows and alders, dogwoods, winterberries, those sorts of things. And he's also going to start to allow some dead material to accumulate in that area. And this is just kind of a schematic of what a cross-section of a real healthy riparian buffer would look like. I think this picture is from a little farther south of us, so some of the plants may be a little different, but the concept is the same. You have this thick corridor of vegetation that animals can walk through, have some shelter, and a lot of food sources along the riparian area. And this is really important for a variety of different animals. And this kind of just gives you a real basic explanation of where different animals are going to be inhabited in those riparian areas. A lot of wildlife have really just kind of evolved to live in these transition zones and do quite well in this mixed habitat. So the wider the buffer is, the more variety of wildlife species you can enhance, and you'll be able to provide habitat for. Which is all great if you have 400 acres. If you don't have a riparian area, there are other things that you can do to increase this connectivity. And here's just a schematic of just more of a kind of probably a typical backyard area in Vermont. It highlights a not mowed area near the wood line there that provides a bunch of pollinator habitat, some areas for wildlife to move in and out of and feed in. It's got a picture of a rain garden that will collect any kind of runoff from that driveway, and also a rain barrel to collect it. So this kind of meets a couple different objectives, one being connectivity, but the other is also just absorbing storm runoff and preventing erosion and things like that. And if you have a property that has any kind of shoreline or a pond on it, I know a lot of landowners are interested in ponds and how to make those more wildlife friendly. There's a couple great pamphlets and brochures out there. I've highlighted two on the screen here. A guide to healthy lakes using lakeshore landscaping, and then the Vermont Rain Garden Manual. And those are both really easily found online if you just Google those. And they're put out, one's put out by the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds, and the other one's put out by, I can't remember now. I think the Winooski Valley. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe Andy knows. You can put it in the chat. But anyways, they're easily found if you just Google the titles, and they're great resources for people without large landscapes. So other ways to create connectivity that you may have just in your backyard are hedgerows and fence lines, stone walls. They're great linear areas that plants and trees and shrubs kind of accumulate on and provide a lot of hiding holes for small mammals and amphibians and bugs. Flowering shrubs along these areas are like sumac, buttonbush, elderberry, serviceberry are great options, and can provide a lot of habitat and connectivity even on kind of a fragmented landscape. And the picture, the large map on the screen here, so those purple points are GPS points. We had some GPS collars put on bobcats in the Champlain Valley a few years ago, and they recorded the movement of those animals. And what this map really highlights, and we have several different examples of this, is that the bobcats with their collars traveled really primarily through these hedgerows. They didn't cross the open areas, and they really utilized these fence lines and hedgerows that, from a passing glance probably don't seem like they provide a lot of habitat or structure on the landscape, but when you actually look at the data, they are quite important for moving animals around a pretty fragmented area. So, in your neighborhood, think about where your fence lines are between the houses, your property boundaries, or even medians in the roadway. Those can be areas that create spots for wildlife that can move back and forth and just kind of hang out with a little bit of shelter. Oops. So in addition to climate change resiliency, Tim was really focused on making things more inviting for wildlife. And so both of these objectives really depend on native plants, and in turn depend on healthy native pollinator populations. Because it's obvious when you say it out loud, but I think a lot of times we don't think about, like, native pollinators are what are the things that are helping all of our maple trees and oak trees and all of our other native plants reproduce and provide food for wildlife. So really, creating pollinator habitat is probably one of the biggest things that we can do to create healthy forests and healthy wildlife populations. Tim had a large amount of open land on his property that he mowed regularly. He had this located in different parts of his property. And one thing that he told us, like, as we were talking about different options and different mowing regimes, was that he really liked this open space next to his house. Maybe that's not the greatest for wildlife, but it helps him really enjoy his property. And so we were working with him to talk about how we can kind of have both. You can have good pollinator habitat and still have these open lands next to your house. So we talked to him a lot about creating a diversity of species, and that means both in the diversity of plant species, but also in the diversity of seasons that they're going to be blooming. The pollinators here in Vermont, we have an abundance of late season flowers. So you think about all of the fields that we see in late July and August and early September. They're chock full of different flowers. But the pollinators are searching for a lot of food early in the summer when they first wake up, and so we need to focus a lot on enhancing and planting species that bloom early in the season. So we're talking about things like basswood and serviceberry and maples. Willows also bloom pretty early in the spring. So things like that will feed our native pollinators early on. This chart that I have on the screen, if you Google Vermont River Berry Farm pollinator plant list, it's kind of a mouthful, but it's easy to find. And Jane Sorensen, she runs the farm there, and she put together this list, which I think is fantastic. It shows all the different colors and blooms of each plant. So if you're planting, landscaping your house, planting a garden, you can kind of select the color scheme that you want, and it also tells you when those plants are going to be blooming. So you can create a season long, a whole summer of different plants and flowers and blooms and food for pollinators using that list. And that's just one page of it. It's several pages long. So when we talk about pollinators, I think a lot of people kind of think about honeybees, which are pollinators, but that's kind of the equivalent of someone from Audubon talking about chickens. So when I talk about pollinators, I'm really talking about our native bee species. And in Vermont we have over 275 of native bee species. 70% of those are ground nesting, and then the rest of them are mostly tunnel nesting. And so I mention that because it's important to not only provide food sources and the diversity of flowers and blooms, but also to provide nesting sources for them and structures. And so for our tunnel nesters, they go onto hollow stems and snags and rotten logs, and they usually need quite a lot of forage, but they need it nearby their nests. And plants with hollow stems like sumac and elderberry and raspberry canes, those are all great sources for our tunnel nesting bees to live in. So another thing to consider for providing habitat for our native bees is just kind of leaving it messy. Like today when I was putting this slideshow together, I was looking out my window and my front garden looks pretty messy right now. I've got coneflowers that are still just standing up. I've got a bunch of leaves all over my garden bed, and it looks fine once the snow falls, but right now it's not so great. But this really provides a ton of habitat and areas for foraging and just kind of living in during the colder months for these pollinators. Then I also want to just talk about changing our mowing practices. in our backyards. Mowing less frequently, I think everyone kind of knows this, that it can improve pollinator habitat, and it can save a lot of time. um, you know, as an alternative to replacing your whole lawn or planting big pollinator gardens. There was a research team coming out of UMass Amherst that recently studied the amount of habitat that's available on mowed lawns and on different mowing regimes. And what they found was that while mowing your lawn every 3 weeks resulted in as much, as 2.5 times more lawn flowers like dandelions and clover, and a greater diversity of bee species. Compared to if the lawns were mowed every 2 weeks. The researchers also found 93 different species of bees using these kind of less mowed lawns. So even just changing your regime just a little bit can have large impacts on the pollinator populations just in your backyard. And you can download these cute little bee signs, if you're worried about your neighbors complaining that you have a messy yard, and just kind of let them know what you're doing and why they should do it too. So for people who have larger properties or are planting gardens, I know there's a lot of interest in planting pollinator mixes, and there are a lot of companies out there that are promoting kind of prepackaged pollinator mixes. And I just want to kind of throw out a word of caution to try to avoid these if you can. A lot of times they're not region specific, and they do contain invasive plants. I think one of the biggest flowers that we see in these mixes are California poppies, which are kind of spread a lot on their own here and are not great. So if you're looking for a pollinator mix, I encourage you to visit the Xerces website. It's XERCES, and they have region-specific plant or seed mixes that you can order. Vermont Wetland Plant Supply also has regional plant mixes, seed mixes that they've designed that are happy and healthy for our forests. You can also just create your own mixes, buy a couple different packs of seeds and mix them together. Or if you have a field, just let things grow back a little naturally. And if you have any questions, feel free to call us, and we'd be happy to answer some questions about different plants or seed mixes that you have, and give you some advice. And I think a lot of times people think about pollinator habitat as being these big open fields, but I want to put a plug out for young forests and early successional habitat, which if you have a woodlot, it's you're probably kind of familiar with these terms, and those areas are just buffets for all of our pollinators. They have lots of blooms and lots of flowers, and are really great for our pollinator species. So back to Tim. Another thing that we talked about in improving his forest for wildlife was increasing food sources and structures for wildlife. And so we talked a lot about kind of enhancing his native plants. And so for people with smaller backyards, that can, we kind of focus on landscaping and planting and learning about the different plants that are around in your neighborhood. And for larger landowners, we talk about native plants in terms of releasing them, managing by cutting, doing a lot of invasive plant treatments. And so it's kind of a different conversation based on the size of your property, but the focus is the same. Native plants provide really nutritious seeds and berries for our birds and all of our small mammal populations, and they provide habitat for our native insects, which is, more and more research is showing just how critical native plants are for native insect populations, and in turn for our native birds. Native plants, of course, are adapted to our climate, and they won't get out of control like invasive plants, which is always a worry. So if you have any questions about kind of what your options are, I encourage you to check out this website that I have on the screen here. It's vermontaudubon.org. Has a really great database for bird-friendly plants, and course, Audubon's focused on birds, but these plants are good for all wildlife. And the database is pretty cool. You can plug in your zip code, narrow down your search depending on what you're looking for. If you're looking for trees or shrubs or just flowers, or even what kind of birds you want to encourage, and it'll come up with a list right for your region. And I've used it when I've been landscaping my backyard, and it's pretty interesting. The birds that they predicted would come have come. I've got catbirds in my arrowwood, just like they said I would. There's also a website or a Google suggestion for Vermont trees and shrubs for conservation, and that will give you kind of a little more data-heavy spreadsheet of a variety of trees and shrubs that are good for wildlife that you can plant here in Vermont. So there's a lot of resources out there. And so I mentioned Mast or releasing trees, and basically that means like focusing on a specific tree and releasing it from competition of the trees around it. And a lot of times working with landowners in their woodlots, we talk about releasing trees that provide food sources for wildlife. So we talk about things like oak trees, black cherry, serviceberry, hickory, hawthorn, all these that produce a lot of different fruit and nut sources. We also release trees that are great for bat habitat. So things that have trees that have really shaggy bark that bats can kind of crawl under in the summer and stay there during the day while they're raising their pups and be protected that way. So a lot of times those are black locust or hickory or silver maple. So the last time we did this presentation, there was a question from someone who lives in more of a suburban area and kind of asked, well, if I plant a tree in my backyard, it's not probably going to be producing anything for any bird species or wildlife for a good 20 years. Like, how can I, this doesn't really help me. And it's true, that's hard. But I guess if you want to influence the wildlife and bird species in your town, I would encourage you talking to your conservation commission or your planning commission and talking about the different trees that are being planted in public areas, in kind of roadways, and try to talk to them about getting a variety of different native wildlife friendly trees. And perhaps that's a way that you can benefit, because they'll probably generally buy bigger trees than a typical landowner. So the last kind of thing that I wanted to talk about is creating different structures for wildlife. And that's probably one of the hardest things as a backyard kind of wildlife enthusiast to really figure out how to provide that in a neighborhood. A lot of times because it does look kind of messy. And yeah, I think that's kind of the short end of it, is that sometimes it can look a lot of kind of messy. Creating brush piles and log piles can be seen as an eyesore in some neighborhoods, but that's really what a lot of wildlife and pollinators need. Snags and trees that have cavities in them, can also pose safety issues if they're near a house. And so those are things that are really important. If you do have a larger wood lot, I would encourage you to keep those as much as you can. Rock piles are also another great habitat feature. We kind of touched on those when I talked about rock walls, stone walls, on the connectivity part. But even just piles of rocks in your yard create areas for little wildlife. So a lot of people in backyards focus on different structures like bird boxes or bee boxes or bat boxes, and those are great. They can provide a lot of kind of missing structure in these neighborhoods that we don't often see. And my one tip, just to make sure that you are helping wildlife, is follow the plans that you can find online, because I think each kind of bird or wildlife species has a different set of requirements. Like a bluebird box is different than a kestrel box, and so on. And also just make sure that you maintain them and clean them out periodically throughout the season. These structures are great, but sometimes they can be vectors for disease, especially those bee boxes that I think a lot of garden centers sell. Just making sure you clean those out every year is really important, just to maintain the health of the population. And so I guess with that, we'll take a minute to see if anyone has any questions out there.
If folks have questions, please put them in the chat. So it looks like Laura's asking, we have huge logging slash piles. Any recommendations? Presumably, what to do with them?
Yeah, if they're in places where you don't mind them, I would just kind of leave them. They provide great habitat spots for different rabbits and hares and small mammals and a variety of different bird species, and they just provide a lot of good structure. Amphibians can get out of the sun on those. I know some people talk about burning them, and you can. I would just make sure that there's nothing living in them before you do, and then also having a plan to reseed after you burn those piles. They can become pretty hot and sterilize the ground pretty quickly.
So there was a note earlier on from Sabina mentioning, if folks are interested in seeing a pollinator garden in real life and real practice, to get in touch with us, and we can find somebody near you who has one and who would be willing to walk you around and show you around. Mm-hmm. I know, for example, there's a public space, couple public spaces in Montpelier where you can go check those out. So do reach out to us if you'd like to see that.
Yeah, those are, and I realized I didn't talk in much detail on those. They can be very detailed and difficult to summarize in a presentation about lots of topics. So it should be its own presentation right there.
Here's another one. Tom is asking, what width of riparian zones is best?
Well, that depends on the wildlife species you are trying to focus on, but I would say in general, having about a 50 to 100-foot buffer is great for wildlife if you can swing that. Kind of provides a lot of different shade and structure and enough space for like erosion control and things like that, temperature regulation for the water. So for wildlife, 100 feet is probably ideal.
And Bernie's put a resource in the chat about almost 1,500 Vermont native plants and some of the insects that are available to them.
Oh, cool.
So that looks like a neat resource for
I'd like to see that.
Out. What else is on your mind, folks? Any other questions? Okay, Laura's asking, if we wanted to reorganize some of the slash, is there a way we could do it to assist with wildlife encouragement? We've used some along the edge of the meadows and trails.
There are specific kind of plans and like designs for people who are intentionally building kind of brush piles. So I could find some of those resources and get them to you, Laura. Just about kind of what you put at the bottom and how you structure things on top, if that's what you're asking. But if you're talking about locations of the brush piles, I think things that are probably if you're talking about like not putting them out in the middle of the field versus kind of next to the woods, I would say probably closer to the edge would probably be more beneficial. But I don't think it's too big of a critical issue, I think, to where they are.
Great. Barbara's got a question here, noting that they have a meadow orchard that gets mowed 3 to 5 times a year. We try to avoid mowing milkweed, but are not sure what a good timing for that is. I think that's what the question is, Barbara. Did I get that right? So it sounds like
not just for the milkweed, but for the other plants that are growing there.
Yeah, I think in an ideal situation, we recommend not mowing until October, just for all plants, but it doesn't sound like that would probably line up with your overall objectives. So, if you can wait until August, that's really beneficial for a lot of different species. You could also consider kind of mowing in different patterns, like mowing parts at different times, like mowing a third of your meadow one year and a third another year, and doing something like that. Or if you want to mow every year, I would suggest maybe leaving kind of wide boundaries on the edges that create sort of a corridor of flowers and pollinator kind of connectivity that way. Does that kind of get to your question?
Yes, we usually need to mow sometime July or August just to get it down once. It doesn't seem like too much was in bloom at that time. Otherwise, it gets too hard to mow because we only have a walk behind lawnmower and it's an acre.
Yeah, that can really hamper any other sorts of ideas. You could, if you could mow like earlier in the summer and then let it grow out a little bit longer towards the end of August, like that could be a good compromise too.
Okay, yeah, because we usually mow after the monarchs, which are at, like end of October, sometime earlier in the summer, but we should mow earlier because we don't want to hit the milkweed when the monarchs are coming through.
Right. And I kind of mean like mowing it once to kind of get ahead of it for like everything first, and then that way you can wait till later to mow the second time.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
So there's a few more questions, but Andrew, do you want to go ahead and just finish up your last section, and then we'll open up the floor again at the very end?
Yeah, that sounds good. This section isn't very long.
All right. So we'll get to your questions in the chat in a few minutes here.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Those are good questions. Keeping me on my toes. So now I just kind of want to wrap up with some just kind of final thoughts here. And I just want to say, sometimes thinking about like looking at your property, and even if it's just a smaller backyard, thinking about what you can do can be a little overwhelming. I know there's a lot of different information sources, and even I've just given you a lot of different information. And so it can be a little overwhelming knowing where to start. And so I think just, going back and thinking about what's important to you, what do you feel like is missing from your neighborhood or your area that you can provide, is a really good place to start. And just, getting started somewhere is helpful. There's no right or wrong answer. Just starting is the right answer. And so just some really key themes that we talk about a lot with landowners is thinking about diversity. So diversity in the species you have, diversity in the season that things are blooming and fruiting. Think about providing different types of structure, whether it's slash piles or rock piles or dead trees standing, trees that have fallen, things like that, all provide really important components of habitat for wildlife. And then of course connectivity is one of the major things that we talk about in terms of adapting for climate change, and providing any sorts of connectivity from your backyard to larger forest blocks or riparian areas, or even green spaces, is really important as we think about the future of wildlife in Vermont. And then just make it easy on yourself. Go for the low maintenance option. Wildlife likes it messy, and that's really helpful, whether it's mowing your lawn less or picking up things less in the fall. It can all benefit wildlife and benefit the amount of time you spend working in your yard. Then I just have a couple things. We talk a lot about inviting wildlife into our homes, and we just need to talk about kind of stewardship and responsibility about that. I'm not sure where everyone is from here on the call today, but I'm pretty sure everyone here lives in bear country. This season, or this past summer, we've had a record amount of conflicts with bears reported, with bears coming into people's yards and neighborhoods. Even here in Essex Junction and Burlington, people have been dealing with bear issues. So it's really important that if you're living in an area, that you're following these rules about not having your bird feeders out all summer, if you have chickens or honeybees, making sure that they're protected. Now that everyone needs to compost, making sure that you're doing that in a way that's not attracting bears or other wildlife, and even things that you probably wouldn't even think about attracting a bear, like cleaning your barbecue grill or where your trash can is at night, can make big differences in terms of the amount of bears that will be kind of coming in conflict and ultimately having to get moved or dealt with in other ways. And if you want to hear some more tips on that, our website has some great documents and kind of information written up about living with bears, and that's just on our Fish and Wildlife website. And then another thing that we don't talk about too often, and I think we need to talk about more, is the impact that domestic cats have on wildlife. And I'll only say that, like, if we're inviting birds and small mammals into our backyards and having domestic cats outside, it's really kind of just becoming a sink for those wildlife populations. There's been several studies published recently about the amount of mortality that domestic cats inflict on wildlife populations, and it's astronomical. It's pretty damaging. So I would just kind of consider, if you have a cat outside, think about different ways that you can kind of mitigate their impact on wildlife, whether it's wearing one of those collars or trying to keep it inside a little bit more. Really be beneficial. And then also, as we're creating kind of wildlife habitat, we want to make sure that we're keeping the wildlife that we're providing habitat for safe. So, as I mentioned with the bears, we don't want to be putting trash out where they're going to get in trouble. We want to make sure that we keep you and your family safe by bringing wildlife into areas. Sometimes there is that threat. And I wrote this thinking about creating pollinator habitat and where you're going to be doing that. If it's an area where your kids are going to be playing on a swing set, or you're going to be walking barefoot around a lot, maybe that's not the best place to be creating an area for tunnel nesting bees or the like. We also want to make sure that you keep your gardens happy. You put a lot of effort into growing vegetables and things, and those are very delicious for woodchucks, rabbits, deer, all of those pesky animals. And we want to make sure that you keep your neighbors happy too. Sometimes that just means putting up a sign to let everyone know why things look the way they do. They're not manicured because you're keeping it messy for the birds. And just some things to think about as we're creating some more wildlife habitat in our backyards. There's several different resources available for you. If you're interested in learning anything else about this, or woodland management, any kind of wildlife habitat management, I encourage you to look at any of these. There's several different ones you can use on your own, whether it's Vermont invasives or our Vermont Woods is a great website with tons of different resources available. The BioFinder and ANR Atlas are mapping websites provided by our department that are great resources just to be looking at properties and things like that. I encourage you all to check into different organizations like Vermont Coverts or the Tree Farm Association. They have great resources and peer-to-peer landowners that can provide a lot of different advice and support for any kind of questions you have. And also feel free to call a professional. We have biologists on staff that are available to help, myself included, with some other colleagues that can come out to your properties and talk about wildlife habitat. Your county forester is a great resource as well, in addition to staff from Audubon or the NRCS program. There's a lot of resources out there. Our department has 3 books that are all available online that have some really great resources. Probably the one most interesting to people in this webinar is our wildlife habitat management book, and it's available in PDF form on our website. And it goes through a variety of different species, different habitat types, things that you can do to increase the amount of wildlife habitat on your property. And please contact us. Here's my email. Sometimes I'm a little slow at getting back on my emails, but I'm hoping to get on top of that this winter. So please, give us a shout, and I'd be happy to help with the process here. If I can't answer your question, I'll find someone who can. And then finally, if anyone is interested in wants to support this work that Andy and I do, I encourage you to look into donating to the Vermont Habitat Stamp or the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. These two programs really support creating habitat, providing technical assistance for both private and public lands and our non-game species. So if you like what we're doing here, I encourage you to check those two funds out. And with that, thank you so much for joining me on this chilly night. And we've got about 10 minutes. I think we can answer a bunch of questions if anyone has them.
Thanks so much, Andrea. That was great. And we've got a fair amount of activity in the chat here. I'll try to go back to where we left off. And let's see, it looks like Laura had another follow-up question about managing those slash piles. I think, okay. Laura, you might want to just send an email to Andrea, and maybe the two of you can kind of put your heads together offline and figure out something that works.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you one-on-one about that.
It looks like Bernie's put some more links into a blog, including some posts there about building wood piles and critter houses on a 1 acre lot in Jericho.
Oh, awesome.
So be sure to check those out. Ellie has a question. I currently have a forester that is opening a canopy on 4 acres of land and started an orchard, 3 acres. Are you available to help me with ideas on how to maximize the land diversity for multiple species?
I am. Yep. Again, if you want to shoot me an email, we can set up a time. I can either come down or to wherever you are, or we can talk about it virtually.
We had a little back and forth about natural versus messy, and a couple more links to Bernie's blog. So lots of good stuff in here, folks. And I think at this point, we'll just open up the floor. So if you have a question, you can, again, type it in the chat, or if you want to just unmute and ask it live, you're welcome to do so.
Cool. I'm excited to look through some of the comments. This is definitely, backyard habitat is definitely something I'm learning more about. So these resources are great.
Anything else on your minds, folks? Well, just to give a couple more minutes here, I'll share a story. I was recently down at my in-laws in Massachusetts, and they have developed quite a nice brush pile just kind of beyond their compost bin, and they're picking up sticks and kind of chucking them back there, and cleaning up the lawn in that way, and also building some nice habitat. And we see a lot of wrens in that brush pile, which is brought a lot of enjoyment to my in-laws. So I think that's just a great example for how you can kind of meet some of those multiple objectives and also keep it really low maintenance and easy on yourself. They didn't make that brush pile in one weekend with a big work party. They just kind of chipped away at it, and when the storm knocked over a tree, they dragged some other parts and added on to it. So I've learned a lot just kind of watching them take that approach there.
That's cool.
Well, I am not seeing anything else in the chat. Oh, looks like we got one more, just some thanks here. So I think at this point, we'll just call it a wrap and send everybody home early tonight.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Hey, thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.